Welcome to Vermont PBS's Election 2014 Candidate Debates, with all the candidates on the ballot invited to participate. Tonight, the candidates for Lieutenant Governor of Vermont. Here's moderator Mark Johnson.
Good evening and welcome to our biennial debate featuring the candidates for Lieutenant Governor of our state of Vermont. I'm Mark Johnson. We've invited all three candidates for Lieutenant Governor to be with us here tonight, and all three are here. Positioned in alphabetical order, they are representing the Liberty Union Party, Marina Brown, who's from Charleston. Dean Corrin is the Progressive Democratic candidate, and he's from Burlington. And Phil Scott, the incumbent, is the Republican and from Berlin. Our format tonight is pretty straightforward. I have a series of questions. Everyone will have 1 minute to respond to those questions. I may or may not ask a rebuttal, and we'll leave time for a closing statement for the candidates as well. We also have questions tonight from some of you, from our Vermont PBS viewers. So with that, let's begin. I want to begin, Marina, let's start with you. My first question tonight is about the role of Lieutenant Governor. It's a fairly limited job. You're there to succeed the governor should something happen, break ties in the Senate, you preside over the Senate. Does the job have enough to do? Are there more duties that should be included?
Well, it's fine, the set of duties that are available for the Lieutenant Governor, but as Liberty Union candidate, I would use every tool at my disposal to be sure that the working class is not stiffed and that the poor people are represented. That means using whatever procedural means I have at my disposal to defend the working class.
Dean?
I think the job of Lieutenant Governor is actually open-ended, and it is what you make of it. There are the duties that you talked about, but in addition to that, the Lieutenant Governor can weigh in on any other issues that are of great importance to Vermonters. And it can also be Vermonters' conduit into both the administration and the legislature. And the critical issues of the day are issues that I would take on as Lieutenant Governor on behalf of Vermonters.
Well, I've utilized the role of Lieutenant Governor as a facilitator in many respects, both with the administration, sitting on the cabinet with the governor, and that was an area that I think was something that the governor had asked for, and I accepted. And that's been, I think, good for all of us. And in terms of working with the Senate and the House and trying to bring people together, it's been critical in moving legislation forward.
How many times in the 4 years you've been Lieutenant Governor have you had to cast a tie-breaking vote?
It's been 4 to 6 times at different points during the last 2 years.
Let's talk about health care. Dean, let's begin with you. Do you support a health care system here in Vermont that's financed through taxes and not premiums?
Absolutely. I think the only way we're going to get control over healthcare expenditures and control over continuing and maintaining quality in Vermont is to take the issue over ourselves. Vermonters need to be in control of their entire healthcare system. That will allow us to plan for the future also in terms of the many initiatives we have for preventative care that are really going to bring costs down, but we can't really implement them until we have a comprehensive plan. And whether you call that single payer, or whether you call that state self-insurance, or whether you're just talking about an expansion of the VSEA, state employees coverage, to everyone in Vermont, we need that kind of simple, comprehensive plan in order to control costs, which have been soaring out of control.
I think that we have seen what's transpired over the last year or so in terms of the healthcare exchange. I think that there's a tremendous amount of confusion across Vermont, and trying to differentiate between the exchange and single payer. I believe that we should try and get the exchange working. It's federal law. It's part of the Affordable Care Act. And while it's been a disastrous rollout, and we've spent many, many millions of dollars trying to implement, I still believe that it's something that is critical to our future. And we've got to get this right before we can move on to anything else.
Marina?
I support universal socialized medicine for all Vermonters, paid for by income taxes. I also support a medical corps, which would mean that the state of Vermont would select doctors and nurses and other healthcare practitioners as young, help their education, basically be like the military for doctors and nurses and other healthcare techs. And this, they would serve 20 or so years with the option to keep on serving. And this would help lower costs, and it would also help put the control of healthcare into Vermonters' hands. I also support having a healthcare system democratically controlled by the communities in which it is served. This is essential.
Phil, I want to go back here. You pointed out some of the problems with the current exchange, but looking down the road here, you say that needs to be fixed first. But philosophically, this idea of switching from premiums to taxes, how do you feel about that?
Well, again, I've been very consistent about that. I've been trying to keep an open mind, being objective. I'm a skeptic when it comes to single payer. But I'm saying, show me. Show me what it looks like. Show me what it's going to cover. Tell us how much it's going to cost, who's going to pay for it, and give us some details, because those details really do matter. And the uncertainty that we're going through right now, I don't think has been healthy for the state from an economic standpoint. I know a lot of businesses are just holding back at this point, wondering what we're going to do in the future in terms of taxation.
Dean, why don't you share that skepticism, given the problems that have gone on currently?
Well, it's an issue that I've worked on since the 90s. And I wrote bills back then that addressed the issue and looked at the studies we had back then, and we've had many studies since then. And all of them have pointed out that a single-payer system where Vermont is one group of 620,000 people is the most cost-effective way to do it. The cost savings range from $500 million to $800 million a year. Having worked on some of those details, having written laws with those details in them, I know that it can be done. And in fact, in 2011, when the legislature in the state of Vermont passed Act 48 saying that we would move towards a universal comprehensive system, a lot of those details are actually laid out in that 45-page bill.
Marina, I wasn't clear. You said that you wanted healthcare to be democratically controlled. What did you mean by that?
Well, the hospitals should have community control over what happens in them, as long as minority rights are protected. A community health clinic would be, the doctors would be answerable to the community. The community could hire or fire whoever at a clinic. I'm from the Northeast Kingdom. There's problems with healthcare quality in some places. Having a clinic that has a doctor that the community selected, it would ensure that people are happy with the doctors, and it would make sure that the medical system was accountable to the people in the area. The Liberty Union Party believes in democracy in all processes of society. Schools, medicine, whatever you can think of, it should be democratically controlled.
Dean, I've had a number of people question me, senior citizens, about what would happen with Medicare under this proposal. The legislation that Vermont passed would have the state, in essence, act as the administrator of it, and there are, I know, senior citizens concerned that their benefits might be curtailed if the economy goes south. What would you say to them?
I'm glad you've asked that question, because there's a lot of concern about that. And the fact of the matter is that by law, the benefits have to be at least as good as Medicare. And in fact, we have many other entities in the state, organized labor, that has negotiated for even better standards. And the standards that I think should be the floor for our system are those that have been negotiated by labor organizations as their standards.
Are you hearing that same concern, Phil?
Well, I have heard some of that concern, but I don't believe that we will ever endanger Medicare. I would hope not. But it brings up a good point in terms of the coverage. As I said before, it hasn't been defined, and until we define it, and I've heard all the reasons why we should do this in terms of taking the burden off from businesses, and I've been in business for 30 years. I'm all in favor of doing that, but unless you define the plan, and if it doesn't cover what somebody's getting at this point, I think businesses will be back in the game. They'll be back with supplemental insurance. And so the burden hasn't been lifted as far as I'm concerned.
What's a better alternative than the direction that the state's talking about?
I still believe that we should be doing something with exchange right now. I've said instead of signing up for another $15 million worth of contracts with Optum, which was announced yesterday, we have a turbo tax, I call it, on the shelf, the federal exchange that New Hampshire has been able to implement for $8 million, and they have twice the population. So my thought is, why not, at this point, it's shut down, the exchange isn't working, it isn't functioning, so why not implement the federal exchange and then have talks simultaneously with New Hampshire and Maine, trying to build spread the risk, so to speak. Maybe we can do something as a tri-state partnership or a bi-state partnership. I just think that there's other approaches we could take because we're such a small state.
Marina, do you think that's a good idea?
Well, the health exchange really does need re-engineering. I would suggest that it start from a simple, basic plan that people add on as time goes on to have as comprehensive as possible a coverage. As an IT person, I'm just seeing an engineering disaster with the exchanges, and I hate to sound like I'm advocating for a big corporation as a socialist, but someone like Google or Amazon could probably whip something out like that very easily, very quickly, and not have the taxpayers on the hook for an expensive system. Insurance is an expensive overhead. I don't think that's the way to go.
What about this idea of joining the federal exchange, Dean?
I think that's entirely unworkable. Vermont has standards that are much higher than the federal standards, much higher than New Hampshire standards, and we'd be sacrificing them if we went on to the federal exchange. It's completely unworkable. I don't think it's a serious proposal for the state of Vermont, nor is joining in a multi-state agreement, which would simply make layers and layers of complication on top of what we already have. It's important to understand that the reason it's so complicated is because you have interfaces that determine eligibility and all sorts of issues that would not be in a Vermont single-payer plan, and then also have to interface to various multiple insurance companies, which is the multiple where the term single comes from. It is a completely unworkable system that's escalating the price. We've gone from the 90s at $1.5 billion in total spending for healthcare. We've gone to over $5 billion a year now. And Vermont's economy can't sustain that. Our employers can't sustain that. More and more are dropping coverage as a result.
Dean says your plan's unworkable.
Well, tell the 27 other states that are doing it as well. I mean, many other states have admitted failure, and they've tried to do the same thing, and they've gone to the federal exchange. So my thought is, if 27 other states are doing it, then why can't we do it? And why can't we find ways to work? Maybe it is a sort of a customized federal exchange, but I can't believe that we spent $80 million so far. And if there's another system out there that's $8 million, and we've just signed a contract for $15 million to try and fix this broken foundation, why not just take the federal exchange?
I want to move to one of our email questions from Rick in South Burlington, who asks that much evidence suggests that federally, the wealthiest among us contributing the majority of campaign money obtain outcomes of law, regulation, and policy that favor their interests at the expense of the interests of the majority. Here in Vermont, how do we support efforts to fix this problem federally while preventing it here at home? We'll begin this round with you, Phil Scott.
Well, you know, money in politics is a dangerous combination at times, admittedly. But I think that we in Vermont, we've seen where people have spent a tremendous amount of money for campaigns with no success. So money doesn't always equate into being elected. And I think we can look back to state Senate campaigns here in the Chittenden County area and Washington County a decade ago, and look at even the Bernie Sanders, Rich Tarrant campaign, where they spent a lot of money, and Rich Tarrant wasn't successful. So I think it's about messaging. I think it's about trust. I think it's about integrity. And I think we in this state, we get to know each other. We're 620,000 people. It's not hard to get to know somebody or your candidate.
Well, Money it destroys our democracy. I am for getting rid of the Citizens United decision, and I am for implementing as much direct democracy as possible. Vermont has a great history of the town meeting. Where where town meetings have gone by the wayside, I think they should be brought back. I think as much that can be decided as a community directly, where possible, it should be done. And anything to limit the influence of big money in politics, I support.
Well, as the only candidate in the state running with public financing, I clearly support getting big money out of politics altogether. Vermont actually crafted a solution to do that, and the solution was public financing. And so we have a lobbyist tax, not a tax on ordinary Vermonters, but a lobbyist tax that provides money into a fund with which we, if you qualify, if you meet a large number of small donors, only from within Vermont voters, and they must actually be registered voters, no money from corporations, no money from PACs, and no money from out of state, then you can qualify for public financing and be limited to that amount. So as a result, I'm being outspent by the incumbent, ironically, and yet my contributions only come from Vermonters in small amounts, and the rest comes from this fund that allows me to be oblivious to large campaign donations that others get from various industries that we have to wonder about who's representing who.
Phil, you've been critical of the public financing system. Why? What's the flaw in Dean's argument?
I think for one thing, I think Vermonters have enough of a tax burden already without adding to it. When you take, where does it end? It's $200,000 for this one, $600,000 for the governor's race. What if 3 or 4 qualified for it? It's just more of a burden for taxpayers. And I would rather have people give to my campaign, contribute to me because they believe in me, not because they have to through a tax. So it just puts more pressure on the general fund and in other areas.
But how are you not beholden to the people that give you money?
I think that you can talk to anybody over the years. For me personally, I can only speak for myself. And I can look you in the eyes and tell you that it doesn't have an effect on me. And I very much value all the contributions, but the ones that are meaningful the most to me are the $5, $10, $15 contributions where I get a little note from somebody saying, I wish I could contribute more. I believe in what you're doing. But I don't have any more money. Please help us become more sustainable. Please help us become more prosperous in Vermont.
Howard Dean said it gave people access, though. Does it give people access?
My door is always open. I think, again, you can talk with most anybody in the State House, and they can tell you whether you. My first question to them when they come through the door to ask me something isn't, did you give me a contribution? My question is, how can I help?
Is $200,000 enough, Dean, to run a campaign?
It is. It is enough for a statewide campaign. It could be a little more. We are limited, but we've been very frugal with our money. And it's, of course, challenging when you're a challenger to go up against an incumbent who's had many years to get their name out in front of the voters. So name recognition is the big thing, and that means TV ads, and those are expensive. We spend all of our money in the state of Vermont, not a penny outside the state. And we think that's very important. It would be nice if all the candidates took public financing, which limits incumbents to a little bit less. So it's a little bit more of a level playing field for challengers. There are only 4 statewide candidates running in the United States with public financing, and I'm one of them. And I think that's terribly important. I've said that from the beginning of my campaign, that I would seek public financing, and then when we did qualify, and then the Democratic candidate dropped out of the race and endorsed me, that put us in a competitive situation.
What about this question of it being a tax burden?
It's certainly not a tax burden. As I already explained, the tax is on lobbyists. It's not on the people of Vermont. So
is that all right?
I don't think that's how it's done. When I spoke to the Secretary of State, I believe it comes in from corporate interests and filings and so forth, and that money is then any excess in the Secretary of State's office is given to the general fund, and they count on that money. So in essence, it does put a pressure on the general fund.
Marina, why didn't you try to qualify for public financing?
Well, my campaign is probably maybe $200 so far spent. I don't even have wouldn't even have the Liberty Union Party wouldn't even have the resources to talk to that many people about donations. We're not a party that has a lot of money. I'm probably the highest income of the party, and I'm not a high income person.
Let me take a moment to actually talk about that a little bit. I have the three of you talk about what you do for a living. And Marina, let's start with you.
I'm a Unix system administrator. I specialize in what's called DevOps, which is programming servers. It's the newest way of administering a large number of computers, usually internet systems.
Okay. Dean?
I'm the Chief Technology Officer of a renewable energy company that develops underwater hydroturbines that uses what's called kinetic energy, the energy in flowing water, in rivers, in tidal currents, and ultimately in ocean currents. Our turbines are entirely underwater in large bodies of water. It's a technology that's not applicable to Vermont, but I insisted when I joined the company, it was actually built around a patent that I developed in the 80s. I insisted on staying in Vermont and working from here, and with our high-speed internet in Burlington, it works very, very well.
After graduating from high school, I went to UVM. I thought I was going to wanted to be an industrial arts teacher, and went through that, was certified, did my student teaching, and soon found that I wanted to be in business instead. So I went to became involved as a laborer with a construction company, worked my way up, and about 30 years ago, my cousin and I bought the business, and that was the excavation business. We made a deal with the owner, who was my uncle at the time, and we paid him every single week for 20 years to make our payments. So it was tough going. We didn't have any money to begin with, but we worked real hard, and we value our reputation, and I think have a pretty good company.
Dean, you mentioned underwater turbines. Let's talk about the turbines up above ground. You are a big supporter of wind. What do you say to people that don't think they should be on the Vermont ridgelines?
Well, we need to put them on some Vermont ridgelines. The perception that we're going to put them on all Vermont ridgelines is a very unfortunate fact of history, because we had two long administrations who were totally anti-wind. So in addition to not installing enough wind in Vermont, and remember, Vermont is a leader. Vermont had the first utility wind turbine in the world at Grandpa's Knob during World War II. And so we have a long history in utility wind. And what should have happened 25 years ago was that all of the interests should have gotten together, those that protect wilderness, those that protect the interests of property owners, those that are looking at the wind resource, and we should have made a comprehensive map of the state of Vermont and show which ridgelines might be used for development and which ridgelines would never be used for development. And we failed to do that 25 years ago. Some of us tried to get that going, but the administration wouldn't cooperate, and that really set Vermont back in terms of the debate. I have visited folks who have problems with wind, and it is an issue that we can definitely work on.
I'm an advocate for renewables. When I was at UVM, I actually built some of the blades that flew on a wind turbine over UVM for a number of years. And when we first contemplated the wind generation on our ridgelines, I was in favor of the first phase. But after riding my bike up in the Northeast Kingdom, I came through Craftsbury Common and looked over the ridgeline and thought how massive they looked. And the more I talked with people up in the Northeast Kingdom, the more concerned they were. So I advocated for a moratorium, so that we could have the data and actually see whether it's helpful to us, whether they made sense economically from a tourism aspect. And I would say that I think it's outdated technology, to be honest. I think solar is the way to go at this point. And I think that's our future. I don't think it's in wind turbines and along our ridgelines.
all utilities, gas, wind, electricity, these should be owned and controlled by the communities that are stakeholders. The big wind projects were all started by corporations, some of which they frankly bullied landowners into allowing them. There have been landowners that have had court orders taken out against them by the wind companies. This is wrong. I don't feel that there would have been as much opposition to wind if the landowners had been really stakeholders. And again, it comes to democratization of all processes in society. Something like wind turbines shouldn't be owned by a big concern. It should be owned by the public and especially by the communities it affects, the stakeholders.
Dean, can you respond to Phil's comment that he thinks it's outdated technology?
Well, it clearly isn't. It's expanding all over the world, and every new generation of wind turbines has become more efficient, more powerful, and safer. We have a company with a lot of great jobs here in Barrie, Northern Power, that makes a medium-sized 100 kilowatt wind turbine, and they have now for many years a perfect safety record. And it's very powerful, very efficient power, and the entire wind industry globally is about to have 1 million employees, not only in manufacture and in design, but in servicing and maintenance and operations. And that is becoming one of the largest industries onshore and also offshore throughout the world.
Why do you say it's outdated technology?
Because it hasn't seen the advances that solar has. I was at a ribbon cutting for a 2 meg facility in Brattleboro last week, and that took up 13 acres, but 2 megs of power on that one piece of land. And what would have taken probably a decade ago, that would have been 25 or 30 acres. So solar is advancing at a rapid rate, and again, I don't believe there is as much controversy surrounding that. You certainly don't see that effect along our ridge lines. It's so important to Vermont, and if we can do it in another way, I'd say why don't we do it?
But I've heard people complain about solar farms too. Should there be an effort right now, the way some of you have talked about mapping ahead of time? Should there be a similar effort made with solar farms?
Well, again, I think that it's not as controversial. I understand that some people don't like the looks of them either. They don't like the looks of wind turbines, but they don't like the looks of solar. But again, anything we can do to reduce our reliance on foreign oil, to become more independent as a country and as a state, I think is advantageous, and I think we should move forward with that. But there should be some oversight, absolutely.
What about that idea of planning ahead of time?
That would be appropriate, except that photovoltaic arrays tend to be much smaller, much more distributed than wind turbines. 2 megawatts is half of a large wind turbine, actually a third of the largest wind turbines now. They're spread out more. I think there will be problems with the aesthetics depending on the siting, just as there are with wind. There are good ways to site them and poor ways to site them, and that will be up to the Public Service Board under our current law. But I think that all of these renewables need to be used, but they need to be used in a responsible way, and where they need to be limited so they don't impact people negatively is incredibly important. So I would absolutely support tougher standards in Vermont on siting of all of these systems. All power is just shades of brown. There's nothing that's perfectly green. Even though my technology only affects fish and some underwater mammals, and we're showing that it doesn't hurt them, most everything else has some impact. And I often say if you could see asthma, then some of these renewable sources would be extremely attractive compared to what we're doing now with fossil fuels.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, it would be solar can also be under control of more people. A windmill is a huge huge thing that has a lot of capital. I can buy a small solar panel for $139, and it's in many ways solar is a more democratic medium for production of power. And the wind doesn't blow in Vermont like it does in Nantucket or the Adirondacks. It's not. I live near the wind towers, and I often see them not moving very fast. I wonder sometimes if they were built mostly for the subsidies.
If you're just tuning in, tonight we are holding a debate with the candidates for Lieutenant Governor here in Vermont. Joining us are Liberty Union candidate Marina Brown, the Progressive Democratic candidate Dean Corn, and the incumbent Republican Phil Scott. Before we get to some other issues, I want to stay on this question of energy. There's a pipeline being proposed down the western side of Vermont by Vermont Gas. Let's start with you, Phil Scott. Do you support that project?
I actually do. I think that it's a good bridge towards the future. We need some relief. We have an affordability issue in this state, and I call it the affordability crisis. And I think that this will bring some relief from a heating perspective, and also to the businesses that are here trying to support us and bringing in those tax revenues. So we need to put economic development on the front burner, I believe.
I don't support the gas pipeline. I think we need to help Vermonters with energy efficiency so we use less. I'm not even in favor of unqualified economic growth. We need to have businesses that support Vermonters. We need to share the great wealth that the state actually has, rather than basically feeding a cancer, which is what unrestricted growth is.
The pipeline on the west side of the state for natural gas is not entirely natural gas. It would be containing fracked gas from Canada that exports a tremendous environmental penalty that Vermonters for ourselves decided we would have a moratorium on and not do. So there are a lot of questions about the environmental impacts of that pipeline. There are a lot of questions about the underlying economics of that pipeline. When the Public Service Board asked the Supreme Court, to which its decision had been appealed for phase one of that pipeline, to remand it back to them, I applauded that decision, because that gave them the opportunity to really open up the case again and look at a number of issues that had been raised by local legislators, House members and Senate members, who talked about the fact that it may be outdated as a bridge to the future, this use of natural gas, building this long-term piece of infrastructure, when that investment could go into much faster conservation efforts and renewable efforts.
Dean says this is outdated technology. Phil?
Well, I would advocate that the people of Rutland County would disagree. I think they're looking forward to that, and again, they're looking for some relief, and they need some competitive advantages in terms of their energy needs, and this is one way of getting it to them fairly quickly.
As a Liberty Union candidate, you talk about conservation, Marina. I mean, would the government play any role in creative incentives for that, or would that not be a Liberty Union position?
Yes. We would definitely believe that the government should help people with conservation, with insulation, with existing and new programs, and where farmers are required to do runoff prevention, the state should directly help them do that rather than have the burden be on farmers. Yes, I believe that the state has a role, the state as the larger community.
Well, let's talk about property taxes. We'll have a couple of questions on this. What can be done to limit the increases in property taxes? Marina, we'll start with you this round.
Well, I'm in favor of putting the way schools are paid on into income tax rather than property tax. I am for property taxes on high-end properties, but I do not feel that modest homes should be heavily taxed, and the poorer homes should not be taxed at all. No, poor people should not be losing their homes because they can't pay the taxes. In my valley, I see places that are going up for sale because the people just can't pay their taxes. It's an old farmhouse, and it breaks my heart every time I see it.
Well, that's right. People can't pay their property taxes because property taxes are soaring. But they're not soaring because educational expenses are soaring. Education is expensive, and we've made a commitment as a value of Vermonters that we're going to have a high-quality educational system. There have also been, over the years, more and more requirements from the federal government and from state government that have accomplished a lot of things within our educational system that it didn't have to do 30 or 40 years ago because we have such a stressed society. But the increases are due to the structure of the property tax and the changes that have been made in recent years with Act 68 modifying Act 60 to the point that as of now, this year we now have 109 towns where the residential property tax rate is higher than the tax rate on second homes or vacation homes. And I think most Vermonters would agree that that's not an acceptable situation.
I think this is a result of the cries that we've heard over the years for relief. Again, I call it the crisis of affordability we're facing in Vermont. And the property tax burden is something that a lot of Vermonters face. And they're working 2 and 3 jobs, struggling, just trying to make ends meet. And paying their property taxes is one of them. Many people have advocated for changing the formula. And I've said, I'm in favor. If we want to change the formula, that's fine. But I think we have to address the spending side of the equation in tandem or before we do that, because if we don't, it's just going to come out somewhere else. It's still going to be a burden. So in business, if you have a revenue issue, you have to look at the operating costs. You have to look at your overhead, and you have to make some changes in that regard.
How do you limit spending?
I have floated something over the last week or two about the Green Mountain Care Board model, and I call it the Green Mountain Education Board. And we have I've been happy with the results of the Green Mountain Care Board. In the beginning, I was very critical of that, but they've surprised me, and they've been able to bend that curve of high costs in healthcare. So maybe we should implement something like that, taking the politics out of it and having another board take a look.
You don't see a spending problem?
I do see a spending problem, but I don't see any of the tools that the state has talked about recently as good tools to deal with it. Talking about school consolidation, talking about now, just within the since the last debate, Phil talking about a Green Mountain Care Board, state control over all education spending on the local level, which would be a radical reform from any kind of local control. But it's important to realize that the main problem is that the middle class is getting squeezed because we have some protection for the lower income folks, and the higher income folks are not paying their fair share. And all the increases go on to the middle class.
It sounds as though you believe that second homeowners should pay more than what they currently are?
Absolutely.
So would you just adjust that rate upward?
There are ways to deal with this. One way would be, as Marina says, an income tax. I don't think that's politically feasible in the legislature. But we do have a mechanism already built into the property tax system for income sensitivity. And so we protect the lowest income folks with that. The amount of that has to be expanded and extended. One way to do it is to extend that to the full range, and so that everyone would pay their fair share based on their ability to pay, and we wouldn't be putting seniors out of their homes.
Why do you say wealthy people aren't paying their fair share?
Because if you do the math, what you find is that even with a fabulous mansion, the people with the highest incomes are actually paying a lower rate than the lowest income sensitized taxpayers.
School choice? How would you feel about that?
Well, I'm not. I'm in favor of public education. I do believe in some school choice, but I don't really believe in vouchers. If people want extra education, it has to be proven.
We're going to take a question that came in from one of our listeners, a phone call question that came in from Margaret Murray from Montpelier, who asks about the issue of transparency.
Hi, my name is Margaret Murray. I live in Montpelier, and my question concerns transparency in government in Vermont. We keep getting a failing grade from places that decide that we're not as transparent as many other states. I found it amazing that they consider New York State to be more transparent. What would you as a candidate do differently? We have 236 exemptions to the public law. Thank you.
Let's start with you on this round, Dean.
That's a great question, and I am a terrific fan of transparency in government. You know, on the local level, we deal with open meetings law, and that's been modified lately to be improved. And when I was on the Burlington Electric Commission, we never had an issue with that because we always did all of our business in public, and the very narrow areas, contracts, personnel matters that have to be done in executive session were done appropriately, and then any decisions were actually made in public session as they are required to be by law. One reason Vermont gets poor grades is that we have very weak local ethics laws, and while I was in the legislature, we tried to improve them. We had a great committee bill with terrific agreement, but the Speaker didn't allow that bill to move forward. So we've been behind that curve for a very long time now.
I think transparency is part of the answer, and when we look at, we talk about campaign finance all the time, and I believe that instead of looking at how much is derived, how much money is coming in, if we're more transparent about that, showing where it's coming from, where it's being spent, which we've done, I think that's very helpful. I also, Campaign for Vermont has been an advocate for this type of transparency in government, and I think that there are some bills that have been out there, and they haven't been taken up at this point, but I believe that there's some momentum, and I believe that we will be taking those up in the next couple of years.
I'm very much a proponent of transparency. I've worked with Leaks organization, and there's a new Leaks organization for Vermont, VT Leaks, which I strongly support. I am for removing exemptions for anyone who deals directly with the people, whether it's police, whether it's prison guards. I am very much opposed to even staffing and pay questions being behind any type of protections, and it hides a multitude of sins. I feel that government works best in the open, and I'm somewhat of an extremist on that point. I think everything that is paid for by the taxpayers should be open, if possible.
Tell me more about Vermont Leaks.
Well, it's an organization that allows people to submit tips if there's government stuff. My understanding is they've been filing some FOIAs recently.
You know, this is an issue that seems a little bit to me like motherhood and apple pie. I mean, who's against transparency? So, Phil, what is the obstacle to making all this happen?
I'm really not sure. I think that there are many who feel that we are transparent, and maybe we're receiving failing grades from, I don't know. But I think there's widespread agreement amongst most people that I've talked with.
What would you say to that?
I think one of the keys is to make sure that we have really adequate whistleblower laws, that someone who finds fraud or abuse is able to report it without fear of losing their livelihood and all the consequences that can come from that. And that's something that we can look at further, I believe.
Let's talk about the state's prison population. There are some 2,000 plus prisoners in Vermont. 475 or so are being housed out of state. Do the three of you support continuing to house Vermont's prisoners out of state, which comes at a significantly less cost than it does to house them here in Vermont? We'll start this round with Phil Scott.
Well, certainly it would be better if we could house our prisoners here in the state, but that's just not a reality. We don't have the resources to doing so. I was chair of the Institutions Committee. I know how much it costs to build a prison, and it's not cheap. And so if we have to make decisions, we have to prioritize and decide what comes first. I guess I would rather put the well-being of taxpayers, Vermonters, in front of those that are incarcerated. And I know that it's not ideal, but again, we have to make tough decisions sometimes. So I'm okay with what we're doing right now.
I'm very much not okay. The CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, I believe, has committed a great crime against the people of America. They've lobbied for laws that would keep people in jail longer, just to their direct benefit. And feel if there's a corporation that needs to be done away with, it would be the CCA. The United States imprisons way too many of its people. I feel nonviolent prisoners should be released if possible. I think the way to lower Vermont's prison costs is not by putting people in prison. And I've been in the courts in Vermont, and sometimes very frivolous cases are brought that cost the taxpayers thousands of dollars, and we need to stop prosecuting people for frivolous things like touching. I saw one where someone touched a police officer when they were drunk, and this went to court.
I agree that we should phase out the use of any out-of-state private prison operations. I think taking away someone's liberty is one of the harshest things government can do, and government needs to be responsible for carrying that out. Vermont is going to reduce its prison population, I believe, because it's getting older, and people should be released when they get old enough, and also we will go to housing only violent offenders at some point. And so we are going to reduce the prison population, and we should get them from out of state, because even though there's a cost savings to the state, the costs it imposes, financial costs and human costs it imposes on the rest of the family, are really unacceptable.
How long were you talking about for a phase out of this?
I don't have an exact time. I think it has to be done with great prudence, and we do have terrific law enforcement people on the prosecutor's side that are extremely enlightened and are working in this direction. Especially as we reform our approach to dealing with drugs, we will have fewer prisoners who are there simply because they're abusers of drugs, and we will be medicalizing their treatment rather than putting them in the so-called correction system.
Let's talk about the children of this state. We've had some really horrific cases, some children who've been under the control of state supervision, the Department of Children and Families. What can be done at the state and government level to better protect kids? Marina, we'll start with you on this round.
It's a hard question, but I think that's another instance where more community control would be helpful. Whatever community organizations that want to be involved in caring for children, as long as it is open, transparent, and run by the community, so the community takes care of its own kids. I think that would be helpful.
Mark, I think all Vermonters were horrified at what happened to the children under the care of the state. And this has happened before, it's happened periodically over the years, and Vermonters just find that entirely unacceptable. As a result, we've had many changes in the heads of DCF, and I've known many of these people, and they're all brilliant, hardworking, caring people who are operating and have, under tough conditions, including privacy, the needs to maintain privacy for the families involved, for the children involved, and so it's very hard for them to make their case. But one thing that they have said consistently is they need more staffing, better training, and that costs money. And the state has been hesitant to do that. The latest report just out now for Dr. Chen said the same exact thing, more staffing and better training.
Well, public safety is government's first responsibility. Paramount, top priority, and I think that that's something, again, you have to prioritize. And the folks at DCF, I think, are trying as best they can, but they're overwhelmed. And so we may have to put more resources toward that. So when we were having the discussion in the previous question about whether we take out-of-state prisoners and bring them back into Vermont, you know, again, we have to prioritize. If we're saving money by incarcerating out of state, I'd much rather take that money that we're saving and put it in the hands of those in DCF to do a better job protecting Vermonters. So it's tough choices, but we have limited resources.
Let's talk about Lake Champlain. We're going to limit you to 45 seconds on this answer. We're getting close to our end here. Dean, we'll start with you. What more can the state do to clean up waterways like Lake Champlain?
Well, we've got a $45 million grant now from the federal government, and thanks to our congressional delegation, I would hope we would get more of that. More money needs to be spent, unfortunately, but we do have our agricultural community basically doing a good job, and we think that much of the new problem has to do with simply runoff from built-up areas, and this is where it fits very closely into the whole smart growth, where we need to funnel our growth into growth centers rather than spread out all along the watersheds.
I was up in St. Albans about a month ago and talking with some folks there about their issues in St. Albans Bay, and they'd like to see action now. And the $45 million that we received, they're hopeful that it'll be put to good use. They don't want to see more studies. They don't want to see inaction and just talking about this. They want to see that $45 million used for the cleanup of Lake Carmi and St. Albans Bay, and they'd like to see it sooner rather than later. First step, as well as steps to be taken in the future. Buy-in from farmers and those that are contributing.
I'd like to see the money used directly for the cleanup and put in the hands of perhaps a committee of the stakeholders, the St. Albans and other communities, and the farmers. The farmers know their land better than anyone else. They could be a great resource, and basically a good ombudsman to do this rather than, as Phil said, more studies.
30 seconds each. We'll start with you, Phil Scott. Do you support the legalization of marijuana?
At this point in time, I supported the decriminalization, but there are 2 other states that have gone before us. We don't have to lead on every single issue that comes before us. Let's see what's happening in Colorado and Washington before we take that next step.
I support the legalization of marijuana, and I feel a great wrong has been done to people who've been imprisoned or legally sanctioned for use of drugs. I feel they should be compensated for whatever harm has come to them because of that.
I support it also. I think that we will do it, and it's inevitable. I think we need to do it very carefully. We certainly won't be first because 2 states have gone before us, and we're also able to learn from their experiences and plot out a very, very careful course on doing it ourselves.
Real quick here, the Working Lands Enterprise Fund. The 3 of you support that. Marina, we'll start with you.
I'll pass on that.
Dean?
Basically, I support it, yes.
I do as well.
What do you mean, basically?
Well, in terms of how it's administered and how it's controlled, I think there could be tweaks to that system, but the basic concept is something I support.
Okay, before we get to our closing arguments, will you close a loop here for me? Why were you initially skeptical of the Green Mountain Care Board?
Because I thought it was going to be used, it was going to be $1.5 million venture per year to staff the Green Mountain Care Board, and I thought it was just going to be used to implement single payer. And I found since that they've been doing everything but. They aren't coming up with a plan for single payer. They are actually trying to curb the cost of health care.
All right, we're going to get to our closing statements. Thank you all very much for joining us on the program tonight. We drew straws before the program, and we'll begin the closing arguments tonight with Republican Phil Scott.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening to us tonight. I've been a public servant now for 14 years, 10 years in the Senate, and 4 years as Lieutenant Governor. And I've seen many changes over the years, but the one thing that has maintained its consistency is my willingness to reach across party lines, to listen to everyone, and to try to facilitate issues that come before us. And I would continue to advocate in the future, if I'm reelected, to doing just that, to listening, leading, learning, and trying to do what's best for Vermonters in all respects. And I'd appreciate your vote.
Dean Corrin, you're second.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank all the individuals and businesses I visited throughout the last 5 months throughout the state, and the incredibly warm reception I've gotten with my wife, Cindy, and for sharing concerns and issues from around the state. I have been reinforced in my belief that Vermont is doing a lot right, and we have a lot to be proud and happy for. But we also face great challenges, including soaring health care costs, unfair property taxes, and a changing climate. We can and we must seize these as opportunities to improve the sustainability of our economy, grow jobs, and ensure that all can participate and contribute, including the Lieutenant Governor. As Lieutenant Governor, I will do real work, raise issues, propose solutions, engage in debate, and be a conduit for the voice of working Vermonters, both in the legislature and to the administration. That's why I'm asking all Vermonters to join Governor Madeline Kunin, Senator Bernie Sanders, Congressman Peter Welch, Governor Peter Shumlin, and all of the major labor and environmental organizations in supporting me and voting for me for Lieutenant Governor. Thank you.
Well, if you feel that the wealth of Vermont should be shared by all of us, and that development should be done not for the sake of economic growth, but for the best results for Vermonters, then maybe you can throw Liberty Union a vote. We believe in equal outcomes, not equal opportunity. Giving people an opportunity, that's good, but we want to give people equal outcomes where we possibly can.
Marina Brown, thank you very much. Dean Corrin, thank you. Phil Scott, thank you. Laura Walsh, thank you very much for great job timekeeping. That will conclude our program tonight. Thank you for joining us. Join us next Thursday evening. We'll have a debate here on Vermont PBS featuring the candidates for the United States House race. And don't forget, of course, tomorrow night, catch the weekly Reporters Roundtable for news and analysis with Stuart Ledbetter with Vermont This Week at 7:30. I'm Mark Johnson. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night.